The funeral shovel struck bone with a sound like breaking promises. Jack Tannen froze his weathered hands, gripping the oak handle as metal scraped against something that shouldn't have been in Samuel's grave. The afternoon sun blazed overhead, turning Boot Hill Cemetery into a furnace. But ice ran through Jack's veins as he knelt and brushed away loose earth with trembling fingers. A human skull grinned up at him from the alkali soil. Adult, old, wearing the tattered remains of a cavalry hat that had seen better decades. Brass buttons gleamed dully in the harsh light, and Jack caught a glimpse of something else, a piece of metal deliberately placed, catching the sun like a signal. Well, look what we found. Jack spun dirt still clinging to his fingers as three riders emerged from behind the weathered headstones like specters born from desert heat. Their leader sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man who'd killed before and expected to kill again. Clay Coleman wore a badge on his vest, territorial marshal, but the cold smile beneath his hat brim belonged to something far more dangerous than law enforcement. The other two riders flanked Coleman with military precision, their hands resting easy on gun butts. Professional killers wearing government badges, the kind of men who asked no questions and left no witnesses. A busy day, Jack. Coleman's voice carried the lazy drawl of educated violence, smooth as snake oil and twice as poisonous. Didn't expect to find you grave robbing on such a fine afternoon. Jack's hand moved instinctively toward his Colt, then stopped. These weren't common outlaws or drifters looking for easy money. The way they held their weapons, the way they'd positioned themselves in a perfect triangle around his position, professional killers with military training and government backing, just burying my boy. Jack said, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. Samuel's pine coffin sat beside the half-dug grave, the brass compass that had been his most prized possession glinting on the scratched lid. The boy had won it in a shooting contest. When he was 14, had carried it everywhere like a talisman against the harsh realities of frontier life. Funny thing about your boy, Coleman said, dismounting with fluid grace that spoke of years in the saddle. He was asking questions before he died. Wrong kinds of questions about the wrong kinds of people. Jack felt the world tilt beneath his feet like quicksand. Samuel had been shot in Tucson 3 days ago, supposedly over a poker game gone bad. But the undertaker had mentioned Powder Burn's close-range execution style, the kind of killing that suggested cold blood rather than hot tempers. What questions? Jack asked, though part of him already dreaded the answer. About wagon trains that travel at night. About cargo that doesn't appear on any official manifest. About why certain government supplies never reach their designated destinations. Coleman's smile widened, revealing teeth stained by tobacco and bad intentions. Your boy was developing quite an interest in territorial commerce. The pieces clicked together in Jack's mind like bullets sliding into a cylinder. Samuel had stumbled onto something big, seen something he shouldn't have asked questions that powerful men wanted left unasked. And now Jack was digging graves on top of old murders, uncovering secrets that had been buried for decades. Your boy saw a weapons transfer near Devil's Canyon 2 weeks ago. Coleman continued his tone conversational, despite the 3 guns trained on Jack's position. Started following wagons, taking notes, asking locals about shipping schedules. Had to be stopped before he could spread his curiosity to others. Jack's grief crystallized into rage, but he forced himself to remain still. 3 guns against 1, and him caught in the open with nowhere to run. Bad odds even for a man who'd worn a badge for 20 years and lived to tell about it. The skeleton, Jack said, buying time while his eyes cataloged distances and angles. Who was he? Someone else who asked too many questions about the wrong people. This particular plot's been busy for quite a while. Boot Hill's got more secrets buried under it than most folks realize. A distant rumble made all 4 men turn toward the horizon. Black smoke rose from the direction of Devil's Canyon, thick and oily against the azure sky. Something big was burning out there, sending up a pillar of smoke visible for miles. Coleman cursed with the fluency of a man accustomed to plans going awry. That's today's shipment. Goddamn Apaches picking the worst possible time to go raiding. He wheeled his horse around with sharp efficiency, barking orders to his men like a cavalry officer. Rodriguez, take point and watch for stragglers. Martinez, cover our back trail. If there's survivors from that mess, we clean up loose ends before they can talk. As they spurred their horses toward the smoke, Coleman called back to Jack over his shoulder. Don't go anywhere, old man. We'll finish this conversation when I get back. And Jack, don't think about running. This territory's got a long memory for men who don't know when to mind their own business. Jack waited until the dust settled and the hoofbeats faded, then grabbed his Winchester from beside Samuel's coffin. Whatever was burning in Devil's Canyon, it was connected to his son's murder. And if Coleman was worried about survivors, someone might still be alive out there. Someone with answers about the conspiracy that had killed his boy. The brass compass caught the light as Jack picked it up from the coffin lid. Samuel had carried it, everywhere had planned to use it, when he finally struck out on his own to seek his fortune. Now it would never guide the boy anywhere, except to the grave Jack was digging for him. Jack slipped the compass into his vest pocket next to his heart and climbed onto his horse. The ride to Devil's Canyon would push both him and his mount to their limits, but answers waited in that smoke. Answers and maybe justice for a 17-year-old boy who died for asking the wrong questions. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions as Jack rode hard toward the column of smoke. Heat shimmers made the horizon dance like water, and the sun hammered down with the relentless intensity of a blacksmith's forge. His horse lathered with sweat, its breathing labored in the thin air, but Jack pushed the animal harder. Time was running out, and Coleman would return soon enough. The smoke grew thicker as he approached Devil's Canyon, carrying the stench of burned canvas and something worse, the sweet, cloying smell of roasted meat that could only mean one thing. He'd encountered that particular combination during the war after battles where bodies lay too long under the summer sun and the memory made his stomach churn. Devil's Canyon was a natural trap, its red sandstone walls rising like cathedral spires on both sides of a narrow passage that had been carved by millennia of flash floods. Perfect for ambushes, perfect for disposing of inconvenient witnesses, perfect for the kind of business that required privacy and permanent silence. Jack found the wagon train at the canyon's heart, 4 military freight wagons reduced to smoking skeletons of iron and ash. Bodies lay scattered in the sand around the wreckage, but something about their positioning was wrong. These people hadn't died fighting for their lives. They'd been executed after the attack shot while kneeling in surrender. The wagons themselves told a story of systematic destruction. Someone had taken the time to burn them thoroughly to ensure that any evidence of their cargo would be reduced to unidentifiable ash. But they'd missed something, or maybe they'd been interrupted by whatever had sent them fleeing. From the wreckage of the lead wagon came a sound that stopped Jack's heart, a baby crying. The wail was thin and desperate, and the sound of a life hanging by the thinnest of threads. Jack followed it to the overturned wagon, where someone had built a false bottom beneath the driver's seat. The hiding place was cunningly concealed invisible, unless you knew exactly where to look. Hidden inside, wrapped in a scorched cavalry coat, was an infant maybe 4 months old. The child had dark hair and darker eyes that seemed to hold too much knowledge for such a young face. Someone had taken great care to hide him, to protect him from whatever fate had befallen the wagon train. The baby was thin, but not starved clean, but not recently bathed, suggesting he'd been cared for until very recently. Jesus, Jack whispered, lifting the infant from its hiding place with hands that trembled despite 2 decades of handling life and death situations. How'd you survive this hell? The infant made soft sounds, not quite crying, not quite contentment. His small fist closed around Jack's finger with surprising strength, and Jack felt something shift in his chest, an emotion he'd thought buried with his wife Mary 5 years ago. Pinned to the cavalry coat was a brass locket, its surface engraved with the initials A.H.T. Jack opened it with trembling fingers, revealing a photograph inside a young man in Pinkerton detective uniform, standing beside a woman with gentle eyes and a kind smile. On the back in careful script, Abraham H. Tilden and beloved wife Sarah, 1874. Abraham H. Tilden. Jack knew the name from newspaper accounts over the past 2 years. A Pinkerton agent investigating territorial corruption, the kind of man who asked inconvenient questions and refused to be bought off. The kind of man who made enemies in high places and usually ended up dead in ditches. But the photograph was just a cover. Behind it, folded small and carefully preserved, was a thin piece of paper. A map fragment hand-drawn with the kind of precision that suggested military training. It showed terrain Jack didn't recognize, but at the bottom in faded ink, barely visible to the naked eye, were the words that would change everything. Find MB at the Copper Star. The baby whimpered in his arms, and Jack felt that strange stirring again, a protective instinct he hadn't experienced since Samuel was born. This child was an orphan now, just as Jack was childless. But unlike Jack, the infant still had hope, still had a future, if someone was willing to fight for it. "Don't you worry, little one," Jack whispered, surprised by the gentleness in his own voice. "I got you now. Nobody's going to hurt you while old Jack's breathing." Hoofbeats echoed from the canyon entrance, bouncing off the stone walls like thunder. Coleman and his men had returned, and there was nowhere to run. The canyon was a box sheer walls on 3 sides, and killers at the only exit. Jack was trapped with a baby in his arms and questions that needed answering. "Found something interesting," Coleman's voice carried clearly across the canyon floor as he dismounted near the burned wagons. Jack looked around desperately for cover, still holding the infant against his chest. The burned wagons offered some protection, but not much. He was outgunned, outnumbered, and responsible for a helpless child who depended on him for survival. Just a baby. Jack called back, calculating distances and angles while trying to keep his voice steady. 40 yards to the nearest cover behind an overturned wagon. Too far to run with an infant, especially against 3 rifles. "That's not just any baby," Coleman replied, urging his horse closer with casual confidence. "That's Senator Marcus Ashes's grandson. Worth more than you could possibly imagine, old man. Senator Marcus Ashes." The name hit Jack like a physical blow to the chest. The most powerful man in territorial politics before his death 5 years ago. The kingmaker who'd shaped Arizona's path to statehood. His influence still echoed through every territorial office and federal appointment. What's so special about a baby? Jack asked, though he suspected he didn't want to hear the answer. "That baby is the key to everything." Coleman set his voice, taking on the fervor of a true believer. Old Marcus was smarter than anyone gave him credit for. He knew his network might be discovered someday, so he left insurance. A cache of evidence that implicates everyone from territorial governors to U.S. senators. Coleman dismounted and walked closer, his gun drawn, but not yet aimed. But here's the beautiful part, that evidence can only be accessed by his blood heir. The old man built safeguards into his system protections that require DNA fingerprint-specific knowledge that only family would possess. Jack looked down at the infant in his arms. The child had stopped crying, dark eyes, alert and watchful, as if he understood the gravity of the conversation taking place around him. "You're saying this baby is the only person who can claim Marcus Ashes's legacy? The only one who can access the final proof of 20 years of corruption? Documents that could topple the federal government if they fell into the wrong hands?" Coleman's smile was cold as winter wind. "And I'm taking him. The network has plans for young Michael here. Big plans that require him to grow up understanding his responsibilities." "Like hell you are." Jack dove sideways as gunfire erupted around him. He rolled behind the burned wagon, feeling the baby's heart beating rapidly against his chest. Bullets spanged off iron wheel rims and chewed through charred wood, but the wreckage provided decent cover for the moment. "Don't kill the baby," Coleman shouted over the gunfire. "We need him alive and unharmed. He's no good to us dead." That was Jack's only advantage in this fight. The men hunting him had to be careful, had to avoid hitting the infant. It wouldn't save him in the long run, but it might buy him time to find an escape route. Jack drew his Colt and returned fire, making the gunmen duck behind rocks and debris. But he was outnumbered 3-1, trapped in a canyon with no way out, responsible for protecting a child who couldn't protect himself. The baby whimpered softly, and Jack felt something shift in his chest again. This child was innocent, helpless, completely dependent on him for protection. Just like Samuel had been once upon a time before Jack's obsession with justice and law enforcement had driven them apart. "I won't fail you," Jack whispered to the infant, his voice barely audible over the gunfire. "Not like I failed him. Not like I failed my own boy." A bullet shattered the wagon seat inches from his head, sending splinters flying. Jack fired back, conserving ammunition while trying to make every shot count. But Coleman's men were patient and professional, well supplied with bullets, and blessed with all the time in the world. That's when Jack noticed it, a crack in the canyon wall near the back of the gorge. A narrow fissure barely wide enough for a man hidden in shadow and easily missed unless you were looking for it with desperate eyes. If he could reach it, if he could squeeze through with the baby. Jack waited until Coleman's men were reloading their attention, focused on coordinating their attack. Then he sprinted for the fissure bullets, kicking up dust at his heels and whining off the stone walls around him. He made it to the crack just as a rifle shot shattered rock where his head had been. The passage was black as pitch and narrow as a coffin, but Jack could feel air moving against his face. It led somewhere. He pressed through the opening with the infant protected against his chest, feeling sandstone scrape his back and shoulders. Behind him, he heard Coleman cursing with creative fluency. "Find another way around, check the rim. He can't have gone far with a baby." The passage twisted and climbed through the mountain's heart, carved by ancient waters that had found weakness in the stone. Jack followed it by touch, one hand on the wall. For guidance, the other cradling the baby. The child seemed to understand the need for quiet-making, only soft sounds as they climbed through the darkness. Gradually, Jack began to see light filtering down from above. The passage opened onto a ledge high above the canyon floor, offering a view of the entire gorge. Coleman and his men were still down there, searching the wreckage and cursing their luck. Jack had bought time, but not much. These men were professionals. They'd figure out his escape route soon enough. In the distance, Dead Crow's Hollow shimmered in the afternoon heat like a mirage. The town looked peaceful from this height, almost abandoned, but Jack knew better. In a place like this, corruption festered like gangrene, and strangers were marked for death before they'd finished tying their horses. He studied the map fragment again, noting details he'd missed before. The landmarks were subtle but recognizable rock formations that corresponded to the peaks visible from his current position. At the bottom of the map, almost invisible unless you knew where to look, were the words, "Find MB at the Copper Star." MB, someone who could help someone Abraham Tilden had trusted with his life and his secrets. Someone waiting in Dead Crow's Hollow for a baby who might never arrive. The descent from the ledge was treacherous, with an infant in his arms, especially as the sun began to sink toward the western peaks. Jack had to move slowly, testing each handhold and foothold, while the baby grew heavier with fatigue. But he'd tracked men through this country for 2 decades, had learned to read stone and sand like a book written in blood and desperation. By the time he reached the canyon floor on the opposite side from Coleman's position, twilight was painting the desert in shades of purple and gold. Jack had maybe an hour of light left, enough to reach Dead Crow's Hollow if he pushed hard and his horse didn't give out. The baby had fallen asleep against his chest, exhausted by the day's trauma. Jack found himself talking to the child as they rode, his voice barely audible over the steady rhythm of hoofbeats. "Your daddy was a brave man, little one. Braver than me, maybe. He saw something wrong and tried to fix it even when it put him in danger. That takes real courage." Dead Crow's Hollow had the look of a town that had given up hope somewhere along the way. Adobe buildings crumbled under the desert sun, and their walls scarred by wind and neglect, and the kind of violence that came when law was just another word for whoever held the most guns. But the Copper Star Saloon seemed different, newer, better maintained, as if someone still cared about keeping up appearances. Jack approached the town cautiously, studying the buildings and noting the lack of normal evening activity. No children playing in the streets, no women hanging laundry, no men sitting on porches discussing the day's events. It felt like a place holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. The saloon sat at the corner of the main plaza, its painted sign faded but still legible in the dying light. Through the batwing doors, Jack could see oil lamps flickering and hear the murmur of conversation. The place was nearly empty, just a bartender polishing glasses and a woman sitting alone at a corner table. The woman behind the bar looked up as Jack entered, and her face went pale as bleached bone. She was maybe 30 years old, with prematurely silver hair and eyes that had seen too much violence for someone so young. Her dress was simple but well made, and she moved with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to danger. "My God," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the baby's soft breathing. "You found him." Jack's hand moved instinctively to his gun, 20 years of law enforcement training taking over despite his exhaustion. "You know about the baby?" "I know about everything," she said, setting down the glass she'd been polishing with hands that trembled slightly. "I'm Mara Bell. I've been waiting for someone to bring Michael home. Your MB. Abraham was my partner," she said, tears forming in her eyes, like desert rain, rare and precious. "That's our child you're holding." The words hit Jack like a rifle shot to the chest. "Your child, mine and Abraham's. We couldn't marry, he was already wed to Sarah, but Michael is our son. The son Abraham never knew he had." Jack studied her face, looking for signs of deception, while his mind raced to process this new information. Sarah Tilden was his wife. Sarah died 2 years ago. Murdered, though they made it look like fever. She'd discovered the arms smuggling operation, started asking questions about government shipments that never reached their destinations. Abraham and I, we found comfort in each other's grief. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was uglier than Jack had imagined. You were working together, both of you investigating the network. Someone had to. The corruption reaches everywhere: territorial government, military banks, even churches. Abraham was gathering evidence, but he needed someone on the inside. Someone who could move freely without raising suspicion. Inside what? Mara walked to a cabinet behind the bar and opened it with a key she wore around her neck. Inside were stacks of documents and photographs, correspondence and financial records that made Jack's blood run cold. The Copper Star isn't just a saloon, Jack. It's a way station for the arms smuggling network. Weapons come through here on their way to Apache bands, Mexican revolutionaries, anyone willing to pay gold for firepower. Jack stared at the evidence, enough documentation to hang a dozen men and destroy careers from here to Washington. "You're part of it. I was part of it," Mara said, her voice turning bitter as alkali water. "For 3 years, I helped coordinate shipments, launder money, eliminate problems that threatened the operation. I was very good at my job, too good. I started to enjoy the power, the money, the respect that comes from being feared. What changed your mind, Michael?" She looked at the sleeping baby with the kind of love that could move mountains or topple governments. "The moment I knew I was carrying Abraham's child, everything changed. I couldn't bring a life into this world and then profit from destroying others. Jack felt something ease in his chest, a tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. So, you turned against them. I started feeding information to Abraham. Names, dates, shipping routes, financial records. We were building a case that would have destroyed the entire network from top to bottom. But someone suspected what we were doing. They killed Abraham and tried to kill Michael. Coleman. Coleman works for the network, but he's not the head of it. That honor belongs to someone much more dangerous. Mara's face hardened like cooling iron. Someone you know. Before Jack could ask what she meant, the batwing doors exploded inward with enough force to splinter wood. Coleman strode into the saloon like an avenging angel, flanked by his 2 gunmen, with their weapons drawn and ready for murder. Well, well. Coleman said, his voice smooth as silk and twice as deadly. The lovely Mara Bell and her knight in rusty armor. How touching this reunion is. Jack positioned himself between Coleman and the baby, his hand moving to his gun, while his mind calculated distances and angles. 3 armed men against 1 with a helpless infant caught in the crossfire. What do you want, Coleman? Same thing I've always wanted, old man. The baby, the evidence, and the location of Senator Ashes's final cache. Coleman's smile was cold as winter wind. Nothing more, nothing less. I don't know what you're talking about. Of course you do. Mara's told you everything by now, hasn't she, about the network, about the evidence, about what that baby really represents? Coleman's eyes glittered with something that might have been madness. Haven't you, darling? The endearment carried a familiarity that made Jack's blood run cold as mountain snow. You know each other. Know each other? Coleman laughed a sound like breaking glass. We're family, Jack. Blood relations. Tell him, Mara. Tell him about our special relationship. Mara's face crumpled like paper in a fire. Clay is my brother. The words hit Jack like a sledgehammer to the skull. Brother? The woman he'd trusted, the woman holding evidence that could destroy the network, was Coleman's sister. The woman who claimed to love Abraham Tilden was related to the man who'd probably killed him, Mara Bell Coleman. She said quietly, her voice barely audible over the sound of Jack's world collapsing. I changed my name when I joined the network, tried to distance myself from the family business. Family business. Our father was Marcus Ashes's right-hand man for 20 years. We grew up in the corruption, learned it like other children learn their letters and numbers. Clay embraced it with both arms. I ran from it as far and fast as I could. Coleman's laugh was ugly as a hangman's noose. But blood is blood, isn't it, sister dear? You can run from family, but you can't run from what you are. Jack felt the walls closing in around him like a coffin. So this is all a trap. Everything you told me about Abraham, about the evidence, about your feelings for him, all lies. No. Mara said urgently, tears streaming down her face. Everything I told you about Abraham, about the evidence, about my feelings for him, it's all true. I may be Clay's sister, but I'm not his ally. Not anymore. Touching. Coleman said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. But irrelevant. Give me the baby, Mara. Give me the evidence. And maybe I'll let your friend here live long enough to regret helping you. The baby stays with me. The baby goes where I say he goes. He's family property now, and family looks after family. Coleman's voice turned hard as steel. Whether family wants to be looked after or not. Coleman raised his gun, but before he could fire, the building shook with a tremendous explosion that rattled every board and bottle in the place. Dust rained from the ceiling, and the oil lamps flickered like dying hopes. Outside, Jack could hear men shouting and horses screaming in panic. What the hell? Coleman spun toward the door, his attention momentarily divided. Apache raid. Mara said, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. They hit the town every few months, usually when there's a weapons shipment coming through. Someone must have told them about tonight's delivery. More explosions, closer now, shaking the building like an earthquake. The saloon's windows shattered, spraying glass across the floor in a deadly rain. In the chaos and confusion, Jack saw his chance and grabbed it with both hands. He seized Mara's arm and pulled her toward a door behind the bar, the baby still clutched against his chest. "Move now." "The cellar," she gasped, understanding immediately. "It connects to the old mine shafts." They plunged down a narrow staircase into darkness, the baby crying from the sudden noise and movement. Behind them, Coleman was shouting orders, trying to coordinate a defense against the Apache attack, while maintaining control of his prisoners. The cellar was carved from living rock, part of the original mining operation that had built Dead Crow's Hollow 20 years ago. Tunnels led off in several directions, perfect for hiding or for getting lost forever in the mountain's heart. "Which way?" Jack asked, his voice echoing off stone walls. "That one leads to the main mine entrance. But Jack, there's something else you need to know. About the baby, about why he's really important to the network. Tell me while we move." They ran through the tunnels, guided by Mara's intimate knowledge of the layout. Behind them, the sounds of battle grew fainter, replaced by the echo of their own footsteps and the baby's intermittent crying. Senator Ashes didn't just leave documents, Mara said between gasps for air. He left a key. A physical key hidden inside a locket that opens a vault beneath the Territorial Capitol building. Inside that vault is enough evidence to destroy half the federal government. "Where's the key?" "With the baby. Hidden inside his locket along with the map." The map fragment isn't just showing locations, it's showing how to construct a duplicate key from the original pattern. Jack looked down at the infant in his arms, understanding finally dawning like a desert sunrise. The child had stopped crying, those dark eyes alert, and watching as if he understood the conversation taking place around him. He's not just evidence, he's the key to everything. Now you understand why Coleman wants him so badly. Control the baby, control the key. Control the key, control the future of the territory and everyone in it. They reached a wider chamber where several tunnels converged like spokes on a wheel. Mara lit a candle with matches from her pocket, revealing walls lined with abandoned mining equipment and supplies. But they weren't alone in the darkness. A figure stepped from the shadows, gun drawn and ready for killing. Clay Coleman smiled like death incarnate. "Predictable as always, sister dear. Did you really think I didn't know about your little escape routes? How did you?" "The Apache raid. My idea start to finish. Create chaos, drive you underground, corner you where there's nowhere left to run." Coleman's smile widened, revealing teeth stained by tobacco and violence. "I know you better than you know yourself, Mara. I always have." Jack counted distances, angles, options, while his mind raced for solutions. The chamber had 4 exits, but Coleman was positioned to cover 3 of them with his rifle. The 4th led deeper into the mountain, into passages that might lead to freedom or might be a tomb. "Give me the baby." Coleman said, his voice steady as stone. "Last chance for everyone to walk away from this alive. No, then you both die here in the dark, along with little Michael." Coleman's finger tightened on the trigger. "I'll find another way to access the vault. There's always another way." Coleman raised his gun, but Jack was already moving. He shoved Mara toward the 4th tunnel and fired his Colt in one fluid motion, his bullet taking Coleman in the shoulder and spinning him around. The man screamed and stumbled backward, his shot going wide and ricocheting off stone walls. "Run!" Jack shouted over the echoing gunfire. They plunged into the tunnel as more shots erupted behind them. Coleman's voice echoed off the stone walls, promising slow death and creative torture for anyone who crossed him. But the sound grew fainter as they climbed deeper into the mountain's heart, following passages carved by miners who'd been dead for decades. The tunnel opened into a vast chamber, its ceiling lost in darkness that no candle could penetrate. Ancient mining equipment sat covered in dust and cobwebs, picks, shovels, or carts, and something else that made Jack's heart race with desperate hope. "On dynamite," he said, pointing to wooden crates stacked against the far wall like a gunpowder prayer. "How old?" 20 years, maybe more. Probably unstable as hell. Mara's voice carried a note of understanding. Probably enough to bring down half the mountain if someone was foolish enough to light it. Probably enough to solve all our problems at once. Mara stared at him with eyes wide as saucers. "You're not thinking..." Coleman's right behind us with blood in his eye. "How many other exits are there from this chamber?" "None. This is the end of the line, Jack. Dead end in every sense of the phrase." Jack looked down at the baby in his arms, at those trusting dark eyes that seemed to hold infinite faith in the man carrying him. The child deserved a chance to grow up free, to learn the truth about his parents, to decide for himself what kind of man he wanted to become. "Not to take him," Jack said, handing the infant to Mara with gentle care. "Get back to the tunnel entrance and wait. When you hear the explosion, count to 10, then run like all the devils in hell are chasing you." "Jack, no. There has to be another way out of this mess. There is no other way. Coleman won't stop hunting us. The network won't stop until they have that baby. Michael will never be safe as long as those men are breathing." Mara kissed the baby's forehead with infinite tenderness, then looked up at Jack with tears streaming down her face. "He'll know about you. I'll make sure he knows what you did for him, what you sacrificed. Just make sure he knows the truth. About his father, about the corruption, about the price that good people pay for justice in this world." Footsteps echoed from the tunnel. Coleman and whoever was left of his men, coming fast and angry. Jack pushed Mara toward the entrance, then turned to face the dynamite crates with the resignation of a man who'd finally found his purpose. 20 years old, probably sweating nitroglycerin like a fever patient. Dangerous to move lethal, to ignite perfect, for a man with nothing left to lose except the chance to do one thing right. Coleman emerged from the tunnel just as Jack struck a match, the flame dancing in the darkness like a tiny star. "Don't be a fool, Tannen. You'll kill us all." "That's the general idea," Jack replied and tossed the match toward the dynamite crates. The explosion was deafening, a sound like the world ending in fire and thunder. The chamber filled with smoke and debris, and the mountain shook like a living thing in pain. When the dust finally settled, Jack found himself buried under fallen rock, his legs pinned beneath stones that weighed more than horses. Blood ran from a dozen cuts, and something was broken inside his chest, ribs maybe, or something more vital. But he was alive, which was more than he'd expected. Across the chamber, Coleman lay motionless beneath a pile of stone and shattered timber. Jack heard coughing saw movement in the rubble near the tunnel entrance. One of Coleman's men had survived, and the blast was struggling to his feet with a gun still clutched in his hand. The man spotted Jack and raised his weapon with murderous intent. A gunshot echoed through the chamber like Judgment Day. The man spun and fell a bullet through his heart. Mara stood at the tunnel entrance, the baby in one arm, a smoking pistol in the other. "Thought you might need help," she said, her voice steady despite everything they'd been through. Jack tried to laugh, but it came out as a cough that brought blood to his lips. "The baby, is he..." "He's fine. Scared, but fine." Mara picked her way through the rubble toward him, careful not to disturb any stones that might be holding up what remained of the ceiling. "Can you move?" Jack tried to shift his legs, felt broken bone grind against stone like mill wheels. Pain shot through his body in waves, and he tasted copper pennies. "Don't think so. My back's broken, I think. Maybe my legs too. I can get help. There are people in Tucson who owe me favors." "No time for that. The explosion will bring others, and they won't all be friendly. You need to get the baby to safety before more of Coleman's people show up." Mara knelt beside him in the rubble, tears streaming down her face like desert rain. "I can't leave you here to die alone. You have to. That baby is more important than one old man who's lived too long anyway. He's the future, Mara. He's hope. Jack reached into his vest pocket with trembling fingers and pulled out Samuel's brass compass, the one he'd taken from his son's coffin that morning. It felt like a lifetime ago now. Give this to Michael when he's older, Jack said, pressing the compass into Mara's free hand. Tell him it belonged to another boy who died for asking the right questions. Tell him some things are worth dying for. Mara took the compass with trembling fingers, her tears falling onto the brass surface. What should I tell him about you? Tell him I was a coward who found his courage too late. Tell him I failed my own son, but didn't fail him. Tell him that sometimes the good guys win, even when it costs them everything. The baby stirred in Mara's arms, making soft sounds that weren't quite crying. Jack reached out to touch the child's cheek with fingers that were growing cold. So small, so innocent, so completely dependent on others for protection and love. Take care of him, Jack whispered, his voice growing weaker. Make sure he knows what his father died for. Make sure he has the chance to choose his own path to be better than the men who killed his parents. Mara kissed Jack's forehead, her lips warm against his cooling skin. Thank you. For everything you've done, for everything you've sacrificed. Abraham would have been proud to know you. Go, Jack said, before it's too late. She stood and walked toward the tunnel the baby cradled against her chest. At the entrance, she turned back one last time, her face illuminated by the dying light of the scattered oil lamps. Jack. The evidence, the documents in the saloon, they're real. Abraham really did gather enough proof to destroy the network. Michael will have what he needs to finish his father's work when he's old enough. Good, Jack said, his voice barely a whisper now. That's good. Mara disappeared into the tunnel, and Jack was alone with the dead and the dying. The chamber was quiet, except for the settling of stone and the distant drip of water somewhere in the darkness. Peaceful in its way, like the end of a long journey. Jack closed his eyes and thought of Samuel, of the boy who died angry and unforgiving. Maybe this would balance the scales. Maybe this would make up for all the times he'd chosen duty over family justice, over love. Maybe Samuel was waiting for him somewhere beyond the darkness, ready to forgive an old fool who'd learned wisdom too late. The compass had been Samuel's most prized possession, won in a shooting contest when the boy was 14. Jack had taught him to shoot, had been proud of his skill, had dreamed of the day his son might wear a badge and follow in his father's footsteps. Now the compass would belong to another boy, one who would grow up knowing the truth about his heritage, about the price of corruption, about the courage it took to stand against evil when it wore badges and government seals. That would have to be enough. It had to be enough. Jack's breathing grew shallow, and the pain began to fade as darkness closed in around him. His last conscious thought was of a baby's cry, not in pain or fear, but in the simple demand for life that all children carried within them. 25 years later, Michael Tilden stood in the ruins of the Copper Star mine, reading the words carved into a weathered wooden cross. Jack Tannen, he died, so others could live free. Michael was a man now, 29 years old, with his father's serious eyes and his mother's silver hair. He'd spent the last decade building a legal practice in Denver, specializing in cases involving government corruption and corporate malfeasance. The Tilden Foundation, as he'd named his organization, had become a force for justice throughout the Western Territories. The evidence Jack and Mara had preserved had taken 2 decades to bear full fruit. Corrupt officials had tried to suppress it, to discredit the witnesses, to bury the truth beneath layers of bureaucracy and legal maneuvering. But the truth had a way of surfacing eventually, like bodies in a river after the spring thaw. You were right, Michael said to the cross, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. It was worth dying for. He placed Samuel's brass compass on the grave, the same compass Mara had given him on his 18th birthday, along with the full story of how he'd come to possess it. Inside the compass, Michael had inscribed new words with careful precision. From one lost boy to another, thank you for showing me the way home. The federal investigation had finally concluded the previous year after a decade of legal battles. 17 territorial officials had been convicted, including 3 judges, 2 generals, and a senator. The arms smuggling network had been dismantled completely, its assets seized and distributed to the victims' families and the Apache tribes who'd suffered under its operations. But the real victory was smaller and more personal. Michael had grown up free from the corruption that had killed his parents. He'd been allowed to choose his own path, to develop his own sense of justice, to value truth over profit, and courage over convenience. That was Jack Tannen's true legacy. "I have news," Michael said to the grave, as he did every year on this anniversary. "I'm getting married next month. To a newspaper reporter named Catherine Walsh. She's writing a book about the corruption trials, about the people who fought the network. You'll have a whole chapter devoted to your sacrifice." The desert wind stirred dust around the cross, and Michael smiled. He'd come to think of that wind as Jack's voice, still watching over him, still protecting him from the darkness that lurked in human hearts. "Mara sends her love. She's territorial representative, now the first woman elected to the position. She says it's time for honest people to take back their government from the criminals and profiteers." She's right, of course. She usually is. Michael stood brushing dust from his knees. The sun was beginning to set, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson that reminded him of the stories Mara had told him about this place, about the man who'd given his life to save a baby he'd never met. "I brought you something special this time," he said, pulling out a newspaper clipping from his coat pocket. The headline reads, "Territorial Corruption Network Finally Exposed After 25-Year Investigation." "They're calling you a hero, Jack. They're saying you embodied the best of American values." He placed the clipping beside the compass, weighing it down with a small stone. The president himself issued a statement about the case. He called it a triumph of individual courage over institutional corruption. "I thought you'd appreciate that, given how little faith you had in politicians." Michael had one more item to leave at the grave, a small photograph showing him with Mara at his law school graduation. Both of them were smiling, proud of what they'd accomplished, grateful for the sacrifice that had made it possible. "This is us 5 years ago," he said, propping the photograph against the cross. "I wanted you to see how we turned out, how your sacrifice paid off. We're not perfect, but we're trying to live up to your example." As he prepared to leave, Michael noticed something he'd never seen before. At the base of the cross, someone had carved additional words in smaller letters. He found a baby in the flames and gave him a future in the light. Michael smiled, understanding that Mara must have added those words years ago when she'd first erected the cross. She'd always been the poet in their makeshift family, the one who could capture the essence of a person in a single phrase. "I'll be back next year," Michael promised, as he did every time. "I'll keep you informed about the foundation, about the cases we're working on, about the progress we're making. The fight continues, Jack. It will always continue." He mounted his horse and rode toward the horizon, toward whatever battles lay ahead in the ongoing war against corruption and injustice. Behind him, the desert settled into its eternal stillness, keeping its secrets and its promises. The good guys didn't always win, Michael reflected as he rode through the gathering darkness. But sometimes, when the stakes were high enough and the cause was just enough, they won enough to make a difference. Sometimes they won enough to change the world. And sometimes that was everything. As he crested the ridge that would take him back to civilization, Michael looked back one last time at the lonely cross marking Jack Tannen's grave. The last light of day caught the brass compass he'd left there, making it gleam like a star in the gathering darkness. It was a small thing, barely visible from this distance. But it was enough. Enough to mark the resting place of a hero, enough to remember a man who'd given everything for justice, enough to ensure that his sacrifice would never be forgotten. The desert wind began to blow again, carrying with it the whispers of the past and the promises of the future. And somewhere in that wind, if you listened carefully, you could hear the echo of a baby's cry, not in pain or fear, but in triumph. The cry of a child who'd been saved, who'd grown up to save others, who would carry the torch of justice forward into whatever darkness lay ahead. Catherine was waiting for him when he reached the main road, her press credentials gleaming in the moonlight. She'd been interviewing survivors of the corruption trials, gathering stories for her book about the network's fall. "How did it go?" she asked, falling into step beside him as they rode toward town. "Same as always," Michael said. "Peaceful, like he's finally at rest." "Do you really believe that the dead can find peace?" Michael thought about Jack Tannen, about a man who'd failed his own son, but saved someone else's child. About redemption earned through sacrifice, about justice paid for with blood. "I believe some people earn their peace," he said finally. And Jack Tannen earned his. They rode together through the night, heading back to Denver and the work that waited there. The Tilden Foundation had cases pending in 3 territories' corruption investigations that would take years to complete. But that was tomorrow's battle. Tonight was for remembering the past and honoring the sacrifice that had made the future possible. In his coat pocket, Michael carried copies of the documents that had brought down the network, the evidence that Jack and Mara had died to protect. Soon, those documents would be displayed in the Territorial Museum, a permanent reminder of the price of justice and the cost of freedom. But the real memorial to Jack Tannen wasn't carved in stone or written in books. It lived in the work Michael did every day, in the corrupt officials he exposed, in the victims he helped, in the justice he sought for those who couldn't seek it themselves. That was Jack's true legacy, not the manner of his death, but the life he'd made possible for others. Not the violence he'd endured, but the peace he'd won for generations to come. The good guys didn't always win, but sometimes they won enough, and that made all the difference in the world.